Hello and welcome to the next lecture on plant form and function. This time we're going to look at plant nutrition, which involves a range of nutrient requirements, some context of phytoremediation, and also soil properties and fertility which affect plant growth. You know where to find these learning objectives, and if you look through carefully, you can use these as your study guide for this material. What do you need to know? And as you work through the practice quizzes, you'll also see that these same ideas and items and expectations are covered in those quizzes. And here's some vocabulary words which will help you think through what some key ideas associated with this lecture as well. So let's have a think about plant composition. So if we take a plant, a herbaceous plant, which is something that doesn't have woody tissue, and we dry it out in the oven, we take that biomass, we put it in the oven overnight, it loses something like 80 to 85% of its mass as that water is lost. So the vast majority of mass of plants is as water. I remember in the water lecture we talked about how much water is fluxing through cells all of the time. So these we can also see in woody tissue that there's slightly less than 80% because some of that woody tissue is retains its mass. But for the vast majority of plant tissues, and including the kind of leaves even of woody tissues, the cells are full of water. So much of the water is stored in vacuoles, and most of it is lost in that flux through transpiration. So if you can see on the right-hand side here, this transmission electron micrograph view of a cell, this large vacuole in the middle here is full of water with a dilute solution of solutes, and that holds a lot of that water that gives herbaceous plants that kind of shape. Okay, so then if we take all of that water away and look at what's left, we have what's called the dry weight of the plant. And 95% of that dry weight is organic. That means that it's compounds bound into complex organic molecules. So in organic molecules, the most abundant elements obviously are carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. That's what makes them organic. They have those three elements in them. And this is in plants, this is the vast majority of it is as carbohydrates, as cellulose, which is in the cell wall. And this is why they're interested in plant materials sometimes for biodiesel, because that cellulose is a great source of energy which can be broken down, and that energy released made into different forms that can be used as a biofuel. That's another story. Let's get back to plant composition. The rest of the materials in the organic is going to include some nitrogen, some sulfur, and some phosphorus. And these are the next three most abundant elements in plants after carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So then there's an additional something like 50 chemical elements present in plants. Many of these are believed to be non-essential. They're just kind of there because they get taken up in the soil, but they may not have a particular role in plants. And some of those include things like if you grow a plant in soils that have a lot of particular metals in them, like mine tailings, there's a lot of gold, silver, copper, molybdenum, and things like that in the soil, and it will just take up those compounds because they're there. They don't necessarily all have particular roles in plant function, although calcium and copper and molybdenum do, as we'll see. So to determine the kind of essential nutrients that plants need, it's a little tricky actually to determine that, because if you think about growing a plant in soil, it's very difficult to take just one particular element out of that soil complex to see what is the effect on the plant if it's not there. And so we end up doing experiments using what we call hydroponic culture. And this is where a plant is grown essentially in a water bottle with the roots in a culture solution of water, in which the nutrient composition can be very carefully manipulated, unlike in soil. The problem with this is that roots don't like really to be growing in water because they run out of oxygen, and so we bubble it with air to maintain the oxygen required to support the respiration going on in the roots as it uses up that oxygen. And we'll see in the lab 8, we do an experiment for you and show you the results of what happens when we grow plants in different nutrient content medium, but when we take out or remove one particular element, and what are the effects or what are the deficiencies, what does the plant look like when it doesn't get that particular element. Okay, hydroponic culture is also important for agriculture. Increasingly, we're growing plants indoors in greenhouses. So tomatoes are a plant, a crop that is often grown indoors in hydroponic culture, and lettuces there on the right. And you can see these black tubes here are circulating the hydroponic medium. That's the water with nutrient dissolved in it. This can also be coupled with things like aquaculture of fish, and of course fish excrete nitrogen, phosphorus, other compounds, and so sometimes that can be coupled up and then cycled through the plant material, and the plants can do some of the taking up of those nutrients produced in excess by the fish. So we call it aquaculture and hydroponic culture together. And this is actually, there's a number of places in Milwaukee that specialize in that kind of dual culture of organisms. Okay, getting a little further away from Milwaukee, thinking about growing things also becomes relevant for life in space. So NASA has been very interested in how they can actually grow vegetables in space and in the International Space Station, because people stay up there for a long time. One of the things that they say they crave is kind of fresh food. So if we could grow food up there, I mean, obviously we have to manipulate the environment so that it's healthy for humans to stay there. So why not also potentially for plants? And so there was an article in 2015, the first vegetables that were grown and harvested and eaten in space. And here's an astronaut here showing you a kind of a tray of lettuces that were grown in space, and apparently they ate those, and that was a world first to actually grow things in space and be able to eat them. And there they used a kind of a basic hydroponic type of culture as well. You can see here that they are kind of growing in a kind of reddish light. Have a think about, why would they be providing red light to plants? Why not white light or green light? Think back to the lecture that we talked about on photosynthesis. What colors of light or what wavelengths of light do plants use most effectively for photosynthesis? You might remember that they use blue light and red light, and that's because that's where chlorophyll absorbs. Blue light is a higher energy, so it's a little harder to produce as an energy source, but red light is quite effective at growing plants. And so rather than providing them with the full spectrum of light, many of the wavelengths of which the plants are not going to need, they're specializing in the wavelength that they can use, so as not to waste the energy that is produced, has to be produced in space for the growth of these plants. Okay, so going back a little bit, early experiments here on Earth tried to eliminate one nutrient at a time in hydroponic culture to test what is the effect of that nutrient on plant growth. So this example here shows you a healthy tomato plant that's grown with all the nutrients that are believed necessary, and then on the right is a plant that is grown in an aquaponic culture without copper. And so when you exclude that from the water, you can see the plant looks pretty sick, and that is a copper deficient tomato plant. So clearly copper is important for healthy growth of the plant. And this hydroponic culture identified 17 elements that are essential for most plants, Now, bear in mind there is some variability between plants, especially for the micronutrients. Some plants might require slightly higher concentration. Some may be able to substitute a different micronutrient so they don't need everything. But most of what we know about these is also based on crop plants, because there's been an incentive to try and understand that from agricultural production. And we know much less about wild plants or tree species, which are a little harder to grow in hydroponic culture. So let's have a look at the nutrients. So the first group of nutrients we call macronutrients, macro being large, and this is because these are the elements, 9 of them, which are required by plants in relatively large quantities or concentrations in the soil to be available to take up. And the macronutrients are those elements that are involved in organic molecules, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, but also nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. These are all commonly found in organic compounds. And then we have 3 additional elements, calcium, potassium, and magnesium, which also play critical roles in plant health. So if any of those are missing, the plants are really not going to do very well. They're going to be very sick indeed. So here is an active learning activity for you to do at home. And I want you to kind of think through matching the roles of the nutrient elements on the left with the nutrient elements on the left with potential roles in plants on the right. So there may be also more than one role per element. So carbon, for example, might be represented in more than one of the roles on the right-hand side. So go through this exercise, the active process of trying to work this out. Now, don't necessarily expect that you'll know this off the top of your head, although you may well have encountered some of these ideas in chemistry or in other classes. And, what do you do if you don't know something? You can Google it. So Googling it and having a look on the web or going through the lecture materials to try and work these things out, it was an active learning process, and that will be beneficial to your retention and understanding rather than just trying to read something where I've already provided you with those answers. So use this exercise at home as a review and active learning exercise. Okay, let's have a look at some of these macronutrient deficiencies. So we're also going to have a look at this in Lab 8. So if we deprive a plant of nitrogen, it gets pretty sick. So why is that? Because nitrogen is a critical requirement in proteins and amino acids, and also in the base pairs for all DNA and RNA. So nucleic acids and proteins are both going to need nitrogen. So if there's not enough nitrogen to go around, they're not going to be able to make proteins, they're not going to be able to make nucleic acids. So this is severely going to stunt their growth, and the cells are really not going to be very healthy. Another place where nitrogen is needed is for production of chlorophyll. Each chlorophyll molecule has 4 nitrogens in that porphyrin ring. So if there's not enough nitrogen to go around, it's going to impair the production of chlorophyll. Nitrogen is also important for chemical defenses, so a whole range of different biochemicals, things like mescaline, cocaine, morphine, nicotine, caffeine, quinine. These are all compounds which are used by humans, and we're going to come back to this in the medicinal plants lecture, but these are all alkaloids which include nitrogen in their molecular structure. So in order to make those chemical defense compounds, plants are going to need extra nitrogen. So just as a reminder that a lot of these types of compounds that are used as prescription drugs for human health treatment still come from plants or fungi because they are very good at making these unusual compounds. So here is a nitrogen deficient corn leaves. You can see they look pretty sick. Dying off here. There's not enough nitrogen to produce enough chlorophyll in the center, and generally pretty sick looking plants. So here's just a reminder, those 4 nitrogens inside the chlorophyll molecule here. Notice there's also magnesium there. We'll come back to that. So 4 nitrogens here, and in the DNA or RNA, we have nitrogenous bases. So each of those adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine have nitrogen in them. You can see here the thymine, there's a nitrogen here and there's a nitrogen here. Adenine has 1, 2, 3 nitrogens. You get the idea. And then here, this is a caffeine molecule, so that you can see there's 4 nitrogens shown there in blue. Okay, so just a reminder from that lecture we talked about in photosynthesis and global climate change. Remember, when we alleviate the supply, the limitation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this drives plants into becoming increasingly limited in their supply of other nutrients, especially nitrogen. So nitrogen limitation can be a major problem globally and for agricultural production. And it's believed that this is going to become more of a problem or become more significant under global climate change. So moving on to the next most important macronutrient is phosphorus. Phosphorus deficient corn, you can see it also looks pretty sick. This sort of purpling color is a classic symptom of phosphorus deficiency in plants. And why is this important? Why is this going to need phosphorus? ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and adenosine diphosphate. So anything related to energy transport and storage that needs ATP has that molecule that has phosphorus in it. Also, the RNA and DNA that we just saw in a previous slide, the backbone of that is a sugar phosphate backbone. Once again, phosphorus is critically important there. But also membranes. If you think about all biological membranes are made of phospholipids, so lipids that have phosphorus associated with them. And if you've done some biochemistry, you may be aware of kind of the regulation of enzymes by phosphorus binding and cleaving. So phosphoproteins are essential for regulating cellular processes and biochemical processes. Here we go again, that sugar phosphate backbone on the DNA and RNA. Here the phosphorus in the center of that phosphate. ATP, 1, 2, 3 phosphoruses in that molecule. The phospholipid bilayer membrane, let's have a look at that structure here. We have the fatty acid tailed, a glycerol, a phosphate, and a choline. So that phosphate also has phosphorus in it. Moving on to sulfur. Sulfur is included in some amino acids, just 2 of them, cysteine and methionine. You might remember this from chemistry. So although there's a large number of amino acids, only 2 of them require sulfur. But if you're going to make a protein, many proteins have cysteine or methionine somewhere in that structure, so that's going to need sulfur. Regulation of enzymes and coenzymes, also many of them are sulfur. You may have heard of disulfide bridges, which are a way of regulating enzymes. Obviously, that also includes sulfur. Then there's also a number of chemical defense compounds, alanine, sulforaphanes. We're going to also talk about those in the medicinal plants lecture. These are chemical compounds that include sulfur in their structure. And this picture here of the corn plants, the sulfur deficient plant doesn't look too unhealthy, but clearly the growth is stunted relative to the normal plant. So those chemical defense compounds are found in things like the brassicas, which are broccoli, cabbage, cauliflowers. All of those types of plants have sulforaphanes in them, and this is actually believed to be one of the health benefits of those plants, and that they protect you from cancer because of the sulfur-containing compounds. And onions have these compounds called alanines, which also include sulfur in them. There's a number of other macronutrients, calcium, potassium, magnesium, which are also critically important in plant health. Calcium is a structural component of cell walls, so all of the cell walls are going to have calcium somewhere bound into them. But also cell signaling, critical cell signaling processes, including things like regulation of guard cells. Remember, guard cells are the 2 cells on either side of the stomata, which help open or close the stomata. So the turgor pressure, which is the mechanism in which they use to open or close the stomata, is dependent upon transport of calcium across the cell membrane. Potassium also has a universal action in cellular function as an ion, regulating movement of ions across membranes, which sets up other ways of regulating cellular processes. Magnesium is an important component of chlorophyll. I showed you that picture of the chlorophyll molecule, but it's also involved in enzyme regulation. So magnesium ATP complexes often bind onto or unbind from enzymes, and this regulates those enzymes. Magnesium is also found in cell walls. So there's that chlorophyll molecule with the magnesium right at the center here. Remember I showed you hemoglobin. By contrast, the hemoglobin has an ion, as in ferric ion, right in the center. And these are both transition metals which are able to pick up an electron and release electrons, and that's what they're doing right in the center of that molecule. Magnesium deficient corn looks pretty sick. Chlorophyll hasn't been produced properly. It's all mottled. It doesn't really look very healthy at all. Okay, so let's move on then to micronutrients. And these are nutrients that are still essential for plant growth. Without them, the plants will not grow at all. But they're only needed in fairly small amounts, trace amounts. They're sometimes called trace elements. You may see that in descriptions of fertilizers, for example. And there are 8 core elements: iron, chlorine, copper, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, boron, and nickel. Most of these are complex with enzymes to aid in enzyme reactions. So, for example, we saw the copper deficiency tomato plant earlier. This causes stunted growth, pale foliage, curled leaves, and it also means that the plant will not produce any flowers. So it's not reproductive if it doesn't have copper. So copper is important because it's another transmission metal which acts as a cofactor for enzymes involved in redox. That's reduction oxidation reactions. Because it can pick up an electron, has 2 valence states, copper 2 and copper 3+. It's able to hang on to an electron and then give it up again. So that's its role in oxidation reactions. Probably the most important micronutrient is iron, and the only reason it's a micronutrient is because it's only used in very small amounts, but it's really, really critical. So any plant that doesn't have enough iron, you can see a couple of examples. Here's a spinach plant. The upper leaves, the baby leaves here, are really struggling. They're not looking healthy. And one of the classic symptoms is what we call interveinal chlorosis. That means chlorosis is breakdown of chlorophyll, so it doesn't have enough chlorophyll, and you can see that by it showing up as yellow rather than green, but in between the veins. So you can see along the major veins it's still dark green, but between the veins here, that's where you get that yellowing. And the reason that iron is so important is it's a component of cytochromes. So cytochromes are essential in electron transport chains, both in the chloroplast for photosynthesis and in respiratory electron transport chains in the mitochondria. So without iron, no cells can do any kind of major energy transport processes, and they can't really make energy without iron. Other micronutrient deficiencies. Here is a healthy cannabis sativa leaf, blah. And this is what happens when we deprive the same plant with boron or molybdenum, and you can see they don't really look very healthy at all. So boron is a cofactor in chlorophyll synthesis. So without boron, they can't make chlorophyll, even though boron isn't actually inside the chlorophyll molecule. And molybdenum is really important for nitrogen assimilation enzymes. So without molybdenum, they can't produce the enzymes that allow the plants to take up and assimilate and use nitrogen to put it into proteins. So a lot of these things kind of interact, these nutrients interact. This leads us to some ideas of kind of phytoremediation, phyto meaning plant, Anything phyto is plant, and remediation is really kind of trying to fix stuff up. So this picture in the background here shows you using nature to clean itself up. Really, the idea of saying clean itself up is a little unfair, because often there's bioremediation needed because of industrial production. So kind of toxic stuff that humans have produced and put into the soil that needs to be cleaned up. But plants are really good at taking up nutrients out of soil. So things like they can hyperaccumulate various nutrient toxins, so heavy metals, for example, and some plants are particularly good at this. Willows and poplars and of the genus Salix are really good at extracting toxin from contaminated soil, and then kind of focusing it or concentrating it into plant tissue, which can then be removed from the soil, taken away, incinerated, for example, and then the flue on the incinerator can capture those toxins. So it's a way of kind of transporting them and making them into a more manageable forms. Other examples of phytoremediation include soil contamination after mining and industrial processes, toxic spills, landfills, etc. And here's some mining areas in Colorado, and there's certain plants that can tolerate those kind of conditions, and they're plants that often get planted when they're trying to clean up areas like that. And just as an aside, not only plants but also bacteria and fungi are really good at this remediation, because they're used to being able to use a whole range of different types of compounds. So this is an aerial view of the London Olympic site. Something like 8 years before the Olympics was run in London recently, and one of the reasons that they scored that, they were offered and awarded that Olympics, was because they offered to clean up a brownfield site using bacteria, fungi, and plants, using bioremediation, before they then built the Olympic Village. So it can be a really important part of cleaning up humans' destruction on the planet. Okay. So I'm going to finish this half with a little wake-up question here. These wake-up questions, you remember, were put together in a file and included as a study guide, as part of the study guide for exam 2, and I will do the same for exam 3. So which of the following are true statements about macro and micronutrients? So the critical thing here is knowing the difference between which are macronutrients and which are micronutrients. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. Nitrogen and phosphorus are both macronutrients, but iron, even though it's really important, is a micronutrient. So that these are all macronutrients needed in large quantities from the soil is false, because iron is not a macronutrient. What about copper, molybdenum, and nickel are all macronutrients? No, these are actually, all three of those are micronutrients. They're only needed in trace amounts or small amounts. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium are all micronutrients, needed in only very small concentrations from the soil. This definition of micronutrient is correct, but these four are all macronutrients. So D here, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium are all macronutrients needed in large concentrations. Yes, that is correct. And then let's have a look here. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are micronutrients gained from the soil. Okay, so we're going to come back to this in the next lecture, but carbon and oxygen and hydrogen are all macronutrients, so this bit is wrong, but also they're not gained from the soil. So where do plants get carbon from? Where do they get oxygen from? Where do they get hydrogen from? That's part of that active learning exercise I wanted you to work through as well. Anyway, this is the end of this video, and I will move on to part 2 of this lecture next. Okay, take care.